President Martha Fling, I'd like to, and the Ackerman Institute for the Family, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture. This is the last lecture in our 2022-2023 series. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to make a few announcements. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Sierra, Melissa, and Jamie for all the support that they provide in bringing these lectures to you. This is conducted as a webinar. It is being recorded. We ask that you hold all questions until the end and that you use the question and answer feature. I will monitor along with Sierra the questions and answers feature and will read the questions to Dr. Gartner. Our core curriculum applications are open until June 1st. And our sex therapy applications are open till July 1st. So we hope that you or those you may know, if interested in training, we are the place. Ackerman has been in existence for over 60 years and is one of the premier training institutions in family therapy in the United States. Also, we are looking to open a certificate program for clergy and spiritual influencers in September 2023. So stay tuned for more information on that you'll be able to find on our website, www.ackerman.org. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by the East 87th Street Fund. So we want to acknowledge them for bringing this very important topic and lecture to us. And so that I don't miss anything, because Dr. Gartner has a very impressive biography, I am going to read it. Richard B. Gartner, PhD, is training as supervisor analyst, faculty, and founding director of the sexual abuse program at the William Allenson White Institute, a fellow of the American Psychological Association and 3 of its divisions. He was recently awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the APA's Division of Trauma Psychology. Dr. Gartner has been a pioneer in the treatment of sexually victimized boys and men since the 1980s and co-founded MaleSurvivor.org, a national organization that supports men with sexual abuse histories. Dr. Gartner has made dozens of professional presentations about his work throughout the world and has been widely interviewed in the media about male sexual victimization. He is the author of 6 books, including Betrayed as Boys, Psychodynamic Treatment of Sexually Abused Men, now considered the classic professional text on the subject. Also, Beyond Betrayal, Taking Charge of Your Life After Boyhood Sexual Abuse, which is written for the general public. Other books include Understanding the Sexual Betrayal of Boys and Men, The Trauma of Sexual Abuse, Healing Sexually Betrayed Men and Boys, Treatment for Sexual Abuse, Assault, and Trauma, Trauma and Counter-Trauma, Resilience and Counter-Resilience, Insights from psychoanalysts and trauma experts, and Memories of Sexual Betrayal, Truth, Fantasy, Repression, and Dissociation. And at this time, I am extremely honored to present to you Dr. Richard B. Gartner.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Watson. And I want to thank the Ackerman Institute for the family, and particularly Dr. Watson, for organizing this conference and for inviting me to speak to you all about a topic that has been hidden for too long. I'm particularly pleased to be at the Ackerman Institute since before I became a psychoanalyst, I was a family therapist. And along the way in the 1970s, in the distant past, I spent some time at the Ackerman Institute getting a lot of wonderful information and training from people like Peggy Papp and Olga Silverstein. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight in a totally different point of view, I guess. So it's only in the last few decades that society has begun to recognize the trauma of sexual victimization for men. In the 1980s, when I began doing this work, many professionals didn't really believe that there were sexually abused men or boys, or if that they were traumatized as much as girls were. When I first started seeing the first man I came to realize had been sexually abused, I could find nothing in the literature, in the professional literature about it. There were a few things about women, but not much. And in those books, they acknowledged that boys and men are sexually abused as well, but they said nothing further about it. So you were left with the idea that either that sexually abused men are very, very rare, which is certainly not true, or that they react pretty much the way women do, which is also not true. It's only since 2002, I think, that the church scandals, which I'll come back to in a few minutes, brought it much more into the public eye. In the 90s, when I was doing my first presentations about this, many professionals really wondered whether I was talking about a population that existed, or that the trauma that I was talking about was as great as I was telling them it was. Over the years, that has changed, and I'm really glad that I have been able to see that. But it was a very different picture. I gave my first paper in public, I think, in 1992, and the reaction was very different than it is tonight. So thank you all for coming. So I'm speaking from my experience in the US, but having treated or evaluated men from 6 continents and many cultures, I believe that male sexual victimization is universal in all societies, whether it's spoken about or not. In some ways, it may be more prevalent in societies where no one dares speak about it at all. So research in the US suggests that 1 in 6 men has been sexually abused with direct or penetrating contact by the age of 16. When indirect abuse, such as exposing oneself to a child, is added in, the number is 1 in 4. 1 in 4 boys by the age of 16. Of these, 60% are abused by men, 29% by women, and 11% by both male and female abusers. So contrast that with prostate cancer, 1 in 6. Now, just think about 1 in 6 anyway. 1 in 6 men means that, when you're on a bus, say, a full bus with, say, 30 people in it, say 30 men, 5 of them have likely been sexually abused. Contrast this with prostate cancer. It's also 1 in 6 men develop prostate cancer in their lifetimes. And we hear about that a lot. And it's considered a public, a great public concern. But we don't hear about male sexual victimization in the same way. For any other disease, I think 1 in 6 would be considered an epidemic. And in fact, the figures for men are likely to be underreported because men are reluctant to come forward, and you'll hear about why. There's difficulty in doing research about it because it depends on what you ask men, what you're going to hear from them. And that gets us into the topic of masculine gender socialization, which I'm going to focus on again in a moment. The boys at greatest risk for sexual abuse are those living with neither or only one parent, those whose parents are separated, divorced, and or remarried, those whose parents abuse alcohol or are involved in criminal behavior, and those who are non-white, of lower socioeconomic status, under 13 years of age, and or disabled. And one thing to consider about, this is true for boys as well as girls, is the familial context of the abuse. And something to think about is it okay in this family to talk about bad things? Is it okay to talk about sex? Are children encouraged to talk openly to parents at all about difficult issues? And are boundary violations common in the family? So gradually, since the 1990s, there has been increasing public awareness of the problem. And I'm going to be showing you some slides, and I hope I do it right so that it's fairly smooth. Okay, here is Sports Illustrated. This is a magazine cover from 1999. It was really a surprise to me when I saw it, because people really were not talking about this sort of thing, and it was really cutting edge, and it was a pretty good article. But I don't think it made that much effect on the general public, or even those in the coaching and in the sports athletic world. And I'll get back to that in a moment as well. In 2002, this kind of magazine cover, this is Newsweek, but there were dozens and dozens of them then in the years ahead, when suddenly the Catholic Church scandal of priests abusing mainly boys, but also girls, but mainly we heard about the boys, and often being protected by the church, by their superiors, transferred from one diocese to another, one parish to another. And it became so obvious, and continues to today, because we still hear stories. I read about one just last month, and I don't remember exactly specifics of it, but it has gone on and on and on, but not with the same eruption that it did in 2002, and it was totally shocking. At that point, even if you didn't believe a specific priest had abused a specific child, it was impossible to make believe that sexual abuse of children was not going on in the church or at all in our society. And so the sexual victimization of boys became part of the public discourse for the first time. And then in 2012, this is the Daily Collegian. It's the newspaper of Penn State University. And here we see Jerry Sandusky, who was put on trial for having abused many adolescent boys that he took from an agency that he himself had founded for boys who were in some way disadvantaged. He took a number of those boys, not all of them, but a number of them, and he was finally put on trial in 2012, but as early as the late 1990s, there had been talk about it, but people ignored it. And once again, probably many of you remember it, this meant that there was an outpouring in newspapers about this time sexual abuse of boys and young men in the sports world. And the testimony of many of these victims was really heart-wrenching, and it was printed in certainly in the New York Times, and I'm sure many other newspapers. So let me just get back. Okay. So and because of all of this that was coming out in the media, a number of prominent men have come forward and acknowledged having been abused as boys. These have included athletes, musicians, actors, movie directors, newscasters, journalists, and politicians. And every time one of those men came forward then, and this continues until the present day, that encouraged, enabled other men who had been living in silence to come forward and to seek help, sometimes to do it publicly, sometimes to do it privately, but to get help. Who were the abusers? The stereotype is that it's a stranger, the proverbial man in the trench coat sitting in the park who does the abuse of children. But in fact, it's much more likely to be somebody who is known to the child, and often enough somebody in the child's family. Just parenthetically, girls are somewhat more likely to be abused by someone in the family. Boys are somewhat more likely to be abused by someone outside the family, but known to the child. But the numbers are great in both cases. For the men I have treated, the abusers have included fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, female and male babysitters, grandfathers, teachers, family friends and neighbors, friends of older siblings and older siblings of friends, camp counselors, a family doctor, a godfather, priests, nuns, ministers, rabbis, and the director of a summer camp. Virtually no one that I have ever treated, and I've now treated or evaluated or supervised the work on probably over 3,000 cases like this. Virtually none was a total stranger, or I'm sorry, virtually none of these men or boys was only abused by someone who was a stranger. Some were abused by strangers, but they had also been abused by someone they knew. Note in that list I gave, all of these people are in positions of power and trust, and this has implications for future relationships. And this brings me to the interpersonal trauma of abuse. I'm an interpersonal psychoanalyst, relational psychoanalyst, and so this is very important to me. And so let me show you. The first thing, I want to define some terms here. And by the way, all of these slides that have text in them, like this one, are going to be sent to you. So you don't have to spend your time writing it down rather than listening to what I'm saying. So betrayal is, by definition, an interpersonal experience. It changes the frame of reference for interpersonal relationships. It is a violation of implicit or explicit trust. Seemingly unbreakable bonds are broken. Treachery is introduced into the most private, personal, and trusting relationships. A betrayed individual feels jagged, awry, fractured, recklessly hurt. Of the 6 books that I have published, 5 have the word betrayal in the title. That's not a coincidence. It's because I really believe that the betrayal in the relationships is the real trauma of sexual abuse. Of course, the physical trauma is important as well, but I think the psychological trauma comes mostly from the interpersonal experience. So that's betrayal. How about abuse? With abuse, there's an added component of exploitation. An abuser uses a power relationship to satisfy his or her own needs without regards to the needs of the person being abused. In sexual abuse, sexual behavior is the vehicle for the exploitation. Through sexual behavior, the abuser takes advantage of a power differential with a dependent or vulnerable victim in order to satisfy the abuser's need without regard to the needs of the victim. These needs take a sexual form, but sexuality is often not the underlying motivation. Power is often very, very important as a motivator. Incest. Incest is a psychologically catastrophic form of sexual abuse. It occurs often chronically in the context of a family system that somehow supports it. It's particularly devastating when the abuser is a parent, because the child grows up chronically trapped in at least one twisted primary relationship. Incest, therefore, constitutes betrayal at a most profound level. And now I want to talk about incest in a larger sense. Incest is usually thought of as sexual activity between near blood relatives, but incest can also be construed in a larger sense as any violation of a position of power, trust, and protection. And by that definition, any older caretaker who sexually betrays a child is committing a form of incest, and that can be experienced as incest. Think for a moment about how in the Catholic Church, you call somebody father so-and-so, or mother so-and-so, or sister so-and-so, or brother so-and-so. Children can be very little when they're understanding. But any caretaker in some way breaks through that web, that kind of very delicate web that a child has that he feels protected by when he's with someone who is in a position of power and trust. Okay, so we've been talking about betrayal, we're talking about abuse, talking about sexual abuse, and talking about incest. These words all refer to the activity of the abuser. Trauma, on the other hand, is the effect on the victim. It has, of course, it's related to what the abuser has done, but it's also separate. Trauma is a reaction to an overwhelming life experience. Traumatic events are unexpected, unusual, coming without warning. They exceed a person's capacity to deal with these events. It may seriously disrupt psychological stability and frame of reference. And the reason that I want to differentiate so much between trauma and the sexual abuse that was done that brought on the trauma is that sometimes it seems like a person says he's been or she's been traumatized by something that to an outside observer seems relatively minor compared to other forms of sexual betrayal. But that's not the point. The abuser can say, but I only groped him. But if that groping was traumatic for that child, that's that child's trauma. And it can be very great and surprisingly overwhelming throughout his life. So now sexual betrayal may have been positively framed. It can be disguised as education, as love, as mutuality, hygiene, medicine, like it's what the doctor ordered, or recreation, this is a game, or making a child into a surrogate spouse, or payment of a debt owed the adult, or a fair trade for something the adult did for the child. When it's orchestrated this way as a loving, caring, or playful act, the child is betrayed not only by the behavior itself, but also by the lies, the mystification, and the confusion surrounding it. He may learn to equate abuse with love or care or play. Now, you've all heard of grooming, but I want to define it for you. Grooming refers to behaviors designed to secure the compliance and silence from a victim and often of his family. I'm going to use his here because I'm talking about male victims, but of course, much of what I'm talking about here refers to victims of all genders and sexual orientations. But for convenience, I'm going to use in most cases, him and his pronouns. So he may learn to equate abuse with love or care or play. Grooming is a predator's unique skill and weapon. The victimizer's demeanor, generosity in the community. Remember Jerry Sandusky? He set up this whole nonprofit that did in fact save many disadvantaged boys from from the possibility of some pretty terrible life. But then he abused. But having set up that charitable organization, it was unthinkable that he would also abuse children. So somebody who's grooming also makes sure to demonstrate a rapport with children. All of these things add to their ability to convince others that they are normal, in quotes, and have no deviant sexual interests. Grooming ensures that it's unthinkable to think that such individuals are potential child molesters. It leads slowly to increasingly seductive and sexualized behaviors and demands. And if it's done well, it decreases the likelihood of disclosure by the victim and increases the likelihood of ongoing repeated access. I'm thinking by the way, I'm going to be giving some examples this evening. All of the men I am talking about have given permission to be written about and talked about in professional settings. So I'm thinking of someone that I worked with who was one of 6 boys. And the parish priest became like a family member, came to dinner every Sunday, did favors for the family, did all kinds of work with the family, worked with the boys, was much beloved by the family. And then one by one, he abused most of the boys, all of whom stayed quiet until adulthood. When he was in his 40s, he gathered together his 5 brothers and acknowledged his sexual abuse and discovered all but one had been abused, and most of them by this same man. He thought he was protecting his younger brothers by allowing the abuse to go on. Very tragic. Now, is assent possible? Are children capable of understanding the implications of sexual behavior with a trusted caretaker or any adult? Now, I'm asking that as kind of a rhetorical question. I actually believe that they're not. But often children believe that they are capable. 12-year-olds who said, I knew what I was doing. I was quite willing. But the fact is that no 12-year-old or 15-year-old or many 18, 19, or 20-year-olds for that matter can truly understand the implications of a sexual relationship with an older adult, particularly somebody who is a caretaker, and particularly if it's somebody within their own family. So let me give you some definitions of the sexual abuse for boys. First, there's contact abuse, which is direct and penetrating and the most obvious and easily understood as sexual abuse. Then there's touching without penetration. Then there's overt stimulation, as in exhibitionism, encouraging bestiality or pornography, showing pornography or asking a child to pose for pornography. All of that can be done without ever touching the child, but it's sexual abuse. And then there's covert stimulation. This is the hardest to really put your finger on. It's telling sexualized stories, inappropriately asking about genital maturation, over attention to cleanliness or to enemas, or ridiculing a child's sexual development or private parts. These are all acts that are not chargeable crimes, and but they create a sexualized atmosphere that in itself, without any further touching, can be traumatic for a child who becomes over-sexualized at an early age. Now, the most frequent defense a child has is what we call dissociation. Many of you, I'm sure, know what, or think you know what dissociation is, but I'm going to tell you what I think it is. Dissociated people are often high functioning, though with areas of dysfunction, and this really applies to many people who've been sexually abused. There are three kinds of dissociation in a general way. One is ordinary everyday dissociation. We all dissociate. It's not in itself pathological. If you drive down a highway that you've been driving down for years, you may suddenly realize that you passed 10 exits on the highway without ever really quite realizing it, because you were concentrating on some other thought process or problem. You dissociated those exits because it helped you work on your problem. That's what we might call everyday dissociation. Then there's adaptive dissociation. If you're in a burning building, you're going to be in a panic. If you allow that panic to take charge, you're not going to be able to get out of that burning building because you'll be paralyzed by it. And so you dissociate it by kind of putting it into a frozen little package in your mind, putting it into the freezer there, while your cognitive abilities help you figure out how to escape that burning building. This is adaptive dissociation. And then when you get out of the building, then it comes out of the freezer and you wind up, in shock, perhaps, in a panic, perhaps, all the things that you would imagine somebody would feel after an experience like that. But the dissociation allowed you to escape with your life. If you can't dissociate well, you're less likely to be able to do that. Similarly, if you're being abused and you can't escape the moment, I've often heard children, men, recall how as children, they suddenly found themselves on the ceiling watching a child being abused. They escaped their body, they dissociated from their experience by going up there and not feeling what was going on. That was adaptive in that moment as well. And then there's pathological dissociation. What happens with pathological dissociation is particularly if someone is repeatedly traumatized and dissociates, he or she is likely to find dissociation their go-to defense when they're feeling anxious. So I'm feeling anxious, I dissociate. I'm not feeling anxious anymore. I'm feeling nothing. That is not a good way to be in the world, because mostly anxieties are not best handled through dissociation. They're handled through some other means of dealing with the anxiety arousing situation. I'm remembering one man who was a teacher who himself had been raped while in high school. And he was teaching an all boys class that he really couldn't handle. They understood instinctively that he was still in a victimized persona, and they were merciless with him, and he would panic. One day, he suddenly disappeared. I mean, he literally disappeared in his mind from the classroom, but physically left the classroom, found himself maybe an hour later in the subway station in another part of the city, with no memory of how he got there, because he dissociated instantly when he was being made fun of by these boys who, in his mind, had become the boys who had raped him. So, to define dissociation, it's a severing of ties between mental contents before they come into awareness. What do I mean by mental contents? They can be affect, feelings, behavior, or knowledge of facts, or sensation, so that you can feel two things at once. And even though one, it doesn't make any sense that one would be anything, could coexist with the other, somehow in your mind they do, because you have dissociated them. And you never really ask yourself, how come they both exist in my mind? Dissociation is a kind of a self-induced hypnosis that protects an individual from disorientation and pain. Now, traumatic dissociation is a global defense against psychic disintegration. I mean, we'll call it what it is. This is what happens when you've been traumatized. It protects against the trauma. It shuts down the information processing system. It keeps the experience pre-symbolized, meaning it never gets into language in your mind. It's never a thought that you really have. But it emerges in disguised forms, in enactments, in images, somatic sensations, anxiety states, psychosomatic sensations. That very first man that I treated who was recalling sexual abuse during our work together, and who really sent me down this whole path that leads me here today, he began talking about, in a very anxious state, about images of yellow roses. Yellow roses, he didn't know why. He was picturing yellow roses, but every time he pictured them, he got very anxious, palpably anxious. I could see his body tensing. They turned out to be the yellow roses on the wallpaper of the living room where his father had been abusing him. And as we reconstructed it, in addition to going up onto before he went up onto the ceiling, he would focus on those yellow roses as a kind of a way to hypnotize himself and take himself out of that moment of what was going on with his father. That's how he learned to dissociate, and he became someone who dissociated all kinds of things. He was another one who sent himself out of a restaurant once when he thought a waiter was flirting with him. So dissociation allows the child to encapsulate the trauma and function relatively well in other areas. But if the dissociated material emerges, which it often does in adulthood, it's in the same terrifying, unsymbolized form that it was at the time that it went into cold storage, because it was never processed or symbolized. So frequently, people who have really well-developed traumatic dissociative reactions may go into trance states. They are out of touch with emotions. They have deficits of memory and a distorted view of the world. Dissociation soothes the pain, and in particular, addictive and compulsive behaviors are soothing. And so here we get into all the isms: workaholism, food compulsions, anorexia, bulimia, compulsive working out, shopping, gambling, getting into debt, and especially alcoholism, drug addiction. And in particular, all of them chemically induce the same kind of hypnotic state that helped during the abuse itself. But equally common are sexual and pornography compulsions, often called addiction, but I like to call them compulsions since they're not addiction in the classic sense. They are compulsions, the behavior you do over and over and over again. So that becomes very much like an addiction. With a sexual compulsion, you use the sexual behavior that first induced the soothing effect of the dissociation when the abuse was occurring. And so sexual behavior paradoxically brings on those soothing feelings yet again. So, I'm gonna share my screen again. There are three concepts I would like you to take away today about male sexual victimization: masculine gender socialization, feelings about homosexuality, and fears of becoming an abuser. And I will get to them one by one. First is masculine gender socialization. This is about how men and boys encode abuse. Sexually abused men often say that the behavior, the sexual behavior that the abuser did was non-traumatic. However, these same men are more likely than non-abused men to enter psychotherapy for reasons that seem unrelated to abuse. This is because of masculine gender socialization, which for many men leads to what some have called a masculine masquerade, or simply, often these days, it's called toxic masculinity. I'm speaking in broad terms here. We don't mean that every man is equally influenced by these norms, but in general terms, through masculine gender socialization, boys are told one way or another, be a man. So what does that mean? This is one of the things you don't need to take notes on. These are the conscious or unconscious cultural beliefs about what real masculine men are like. Men are always in charge of themselves, in control. Men are competitive. Men are competent and powerful. Men are mentally and physically tough. Men are resilient. Men are independent rather than needy. Men don't express emotions, as in big boys don't cry. Men are alexithymic, which means they're unable to put emotions into words. Men welcome sexuality whenever it is offered, particularly from women. And finally, men must not be penetrated, violated, subdued, or otherwise forced into submission. Now, probably most of you are familiar with all those ideas, but I'm putting them together because it forms a background for what people are, what men are fighting against when they're trying to, in some way, process sexual abuse. Now, these masculine gender ideals can be very damaging. Infant research to all men. Infant research suggests that socially constructed masculine gender ideals culminate in kind of a terrible emotional socialization through which boys who start out life more emotional than girls, boy infants are more obviously emotive than girls as a group. But through this process of masculine gender socialization, they learn to tune out, stifle, and channel their emotions. And through conforming to the ideal of not expressing emotions, men become strangers to their own emotional lives. They frequently channel their vulnerable emotions into anger and their caring emotions into sexuality. Some homophobic straight men believe that only homosexual men express emotion, and they therefore develop a stoic persona to confirm what they believe is their masculinity. Running through all of these perceptions of masculine gender identity are the usually unconscious views of masculinity as a good substance and femininity as a lack of that substance. If a man perceives himself as unmasculine or feminine, he sees himself as lacking an important and necessary positive element in his nature. And even men who rationally believe that these values are artificial and damaging are nevertheless influenced by them. I think every man is, including myself, often enduring unconscious negative reactions if they feel they have somehow not upheld them. These ideals are devastating to all men, many of whom, perhaps all of whom, long to be free of socially constructed male gendered identity. So let's see some examples of how this comes out in the culture. Here we have all these cartoons. I'm going to show you several cartoons. They're all from the New Yorker. So here we have this buxom young woman and this late middle-aged man, obviously wealthy, and they're sitting in what looks to be his den, and here are the pictures of his the animals he's probably shot on safaris, and all the women he's been with over the years. And he says, "I bagged my limit, Marlene. It's time I settled down." So this is the image of the man as the one who, and we've certainly heard a lot about this in the news recently, and I'm not going to go into that, but it's the image of the cocky older man who can touch and abuse any woman he wants. And he's now saying, "I can now settle down after all of this." Here's a caveman example. There's a television. Caveman is watching the TV and it says, "Warning, the following program contains language." The idea is men don't know how to speak. And certainly, by implication, certainly don't know how to speak about emotions, but really don't know how to talk. Therapists are not immune to this. Here's a Freudian type analyst with a man on the couch crying away, and the analyst says, "It's perfectly okay to cry. Just don't do it where people can see you." Men don't cry. Men don't show emotion. This cartoon was in an edition of the New Yorker that was called the Romance Issue. And here we have a boy of about 10 with a young woman of maybe 17 to 20. They're in his bed, in his bedroom, all the paraphernalia of boyhood. are around him, and she's smoking a cigarette, looking like she is in a French, an old time French movie. And he's very grandly saying to her, I want you to know, Sheila, that you'll always be more than another babysitter to me. This was in 1997, I see, I wrote down there. What does this mean? What is this implying? He's in charge here. He's the one, this 10 or 11-year-old, was in charge of the sexual activity with his much older babysitter. And he's letting her down easily. She's the one who's hurt. He is not. Now think about this. And a way to think about it is to look at what happens if you turn it around. Here we have a 10 or 11-year-old girl and a young man of about the same age. And here she has her dolls and all her girlhood paraphernalia. They obviously just had sex. And she says, I want you to know, Paul, that you'll always be more than just another babysitter to me. People don't laugh at this one. The New Yorker would never have published it. It becomes clear that when boys have premature sexual activity, it's considered an honor. Girls, we don't think so. This is one of the reasons that boyhood and girlhood sexual abuse have different reactions from adults and implications for what goes on inside the child. Okay, so no, let me go back to slides. Here are myths about male sexual victimization. These myths come out of the masculine gender socialization ideas that I was just talking about. These are preconceptions that abound about sexual abuse of boys and men. None of these myths is supported by the research. Men cannot be sexually abused. Women do not abuse sexually. Sexual abuse is always overt. Only sissies and weaklings allow abuse. Children should be able to say no to abuse if violence is not used, and if they don't, they must have wanted the abuse to occur. If a boy feels sexual arousal, he is an equal participant in the abuse. This is a particularly pernicious one, and I'm going to get back to it. Male victimizers who molest boys consider themselves homosexual and are interested sexually in other men. Often not true. Victimizers are always conscious of the abuse they are committing. Also often not true. They are often dissociating themselves. And the final two, sexual abuse turns a boy gay, and sexually abused boys almost inevitably grow up to be sexually abusive men. These myths are supported in the popular culture, not just in the cartoons, but in many movies. I date myself when I think back to The Graduate, but it's the one that keeps coming to me about how the Dustin Hoffman character was, now he's not a boy, he's a new college graduate, but still he's quite young. And he's having this relationship with his father's partner's wife. And it's considered an erotic story, really. And the way they could get away with it was that they cast Dustin Hoffman, who was age 30 at the time, with, I'm forgetting her name now, Anne Bancroft, who I believe was 39. So they were much closer in age than they actually would have been in the story, where he would have been 22 and she would have been probably closer to 50. Other movies, well, there are plenty of them. I'm not going to get into them. Masculine gender stereotypes are basically anti-woman and anti-gay. They express the horror a man is supposed to have about being receptive, about being capable of being penetrated. Masculine identity is at stake in being identified as a victim because victimhood is identified with being female. And remember, even men who rationally believe these beliefs are damaging may feel bad about themselves if they don't live up to them. So I'm going to read you a quote from President Barack Obama in 2019 against all this. All of us have to recognize that being a man is first and foremost being a good human. That means being responsible, working hard, being kind, respectful, compassionate. The notion that somehow defining yourself as a man dependent on being able to put someone else down, able to dominate, that is an old view. I hope that's more true now than it was 20 or 30 years ago, but it's not as true as I wish it were. And treatment of someone who's been sexually abused needs to question socialized gender norms. Not always, they don't always seem to get in the way, but often enough they do if a man or is saying, I could have stopped it. I was in charge. I really seduced her or I really seduced him. You really have to question that if you're talking about a 12-year-old boy and a 28-year-old man. Now, as a kind of a counterphobic reaction to feeling feminized by abuse, some men become aggressive or hypermasculine. That means they become action-oriented rather than self-reflective. And those are the ones most likely to become abusive themselves. And parenthetically, they're also more likely to wind up in prisons. Whereas the ones who are more self-reflective are more likely to wind up in a therapist's office. A mitigating factor for bad outcome, meaning becoming aggressive or a rapist or a sexual abuser, is the presence of a confidant as a boy. This is a kind of an interesting notion because boys who have confidants, even if they never disclose the sexual abuse, are more likely to to become the self-reflective type of victim as they grow older. And the reason for this is that they have learned to put their feelings into words. They have encoded them. And so they learn that that's what you do with feelings. So to believe that he is male, a boy who thinks that that becoming a victim means that he's become feminized, he must transform the sexual victimization to something he sought out and over which he therefore had mastery, and so it wasn't really a victimization. It can be encoded as sexual initiation, especially if the abuser is not a parent and is the same gender as the boy's eventual primary object choice, meaning if the abuser was male for a straight boy, if the and the abuser was female for a gay boy. I'll get into what I mean by that. Yes, I have time to say a little bit to give an example of this. I once was approached on phone. I never met this young woman by a woman in her mid-20s who said she had been in treatment for some time, and the main reason had been she had been sexually abused by her brother, and she had decided to summon her brother to New York and to confront him about what he had done. And she asked whether I'd be willing to talk to him after she confronted him in case he wanted to talk to a therapist about it. She believed that he had been sexually abused himself. So this is a very interesting proposition. I said yes, Again, I never met her, but I did meet him. He called me the next day and came in. He was really quite shaken by this confrontation. He had absolutely no memory of the events she was describing, which were that when he was about 8 and she was 5, he used to tickle her, and the tickling went beyond what brothers and sisters or brothers and any siblings do, and got quite extreme, and he would tickle her where her breasts would be, and then later in her vaginal area. And she would tell him to stop, and he would just keep going on. He did not doubt that he had done this, but he did not remember it. Now, he laughingly said that she thought he'd been sexually abused, but he said, but he wasn't. And I asked him, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. A moment later, he mentioned that as a 7-year-old, he had had a female babysitter invite him to touch her breasts under her sweater, her naked breasts under her sweater. And he said, it must have been really nice. She was very pretty. I wish I'd let her continue. But as it was, I was dumb enough to ask my parents to stop having her babysit for us. And I said, well, why was it so dumb to ask that? And he said, because she was very, he looked at me like I was a little crazy, said, because she was very attractive. It must have been very nice. I wish I could feel those breasts now. Now, it took quite a while to help him differentiate between what a 30-year-old man might feel about touching an 18-year-old young woman's breasts and what a 7-year-old would feel about being invited unexpectedly to touch the breasts of his caretaker. And I said, you certainly acted like this was not a good thing. You asked them not to fire her again. You must, on some level, have felt this was traumatic. And he was very shaken by that concept. This all happened approximately a year before he began doing this with his sister. So my point in telling this story at such great length is to say both of these siblings had been sexually abused. The difference is she knew it. He did not. And that's because of masculine gender socialization. Now, things are viewed very differently when the abuser is female. At least often they are. Some of you may recall, back to magazine covers, the story of Mary Kay Letourneau, who was a 35-year-old teacher who got herself pregnant. And I use those words advisedly because English doesn't help us say that she raped him. Usually we say he impregnated her, but she got herself pregnant by her 12-year-old 6th grader who had also been her 2nd grade student. She was married. She had 4 children of her own. She was charged with sexual, I don't remember exactly what the charge was. And she, the 6th grader testified on her behalf and said, the only thing that matters is that we're in love. And of course it wasn't the only thing that mattered. There was a child that was brought into the world. And she had 4 other children. And he was envisioning a future with her, as she was. It wasn't the only thing that mattered, but it's an example of why 12-year-olds can't make these kind of judgments. Anyway, she was sent to prison and she got out after 7 months, including time served. with the proviso that she not see him again, that she get attend groups for sexual abusers, and that she take medication. Within 2 weeks, she had broken all three of those rules, and they were about to leave the state and possibly the country, and she was pregnant again. So she was charged yet again. And that time she had a much longer prison term. But the point is, she served about, I don't know exactly how much, but 6 or 7 years, but had a 35-year-old married male teacher, father of 4, impregnated his 6th grade 12-year-old female student. He would have had a much tougher sentence than this woman did. And it's because people just can't think that a pretty woman like this woman can really be sexually abusive. I won't go into all that happened after that. They did, in fact, marry and then eventually divorced. Now, it's always possible. I don't want to say it's never possible that that there is no trauma when there's a sexual abuse situation. But you can never tell ahead of time whether any particular child will be traumatized or not. Often abusers say, he loved it, she loved it. He kept coming back for more, he kept coming back for more. That doesn't mean that that child wasn't traumatized by it. And the last person whose judgment I would trust about whether this child is going to be traumatized by what's going on here is the adult who desires that child. Okay, so that's masculine gender socialization. Now I'm going to move on to feelings about homosexuality. Basically, I'm talking here about concerns about sexual orientation. And I want to note that for simplicity's sake, I am talking in binary terms here. So I'm going to be talking about gay and straight. And I'm not talking about anything in the middle. I'm not talking about trans, which is very, very important in terms of sexual abuse as well. But to make my points clear, I'm going to talk about boys who are preponderantly growing up to be gay, preponderantly growing up to be straight at the time of the abuse. The conventional wisdom is that premature sexual activity with a man turns a boy gay. Now, research and theoreticians about the origins of sexual orientation, there's a lot of disagreement about it, and I'm certainly not going to get into it now. But the thought is always, nearly always thought that it's determined for reasons other than premature sexual activity. There's no reason to believe that sexual abuse alone fundamentally changes or shapes sexual orientation, whether this is defined as predominant fantasy, behavior, or self-definition. But molestation by a man undermines a boy's sense of his gender identity and orientation, whether he is gay or straight. He worries about why he was chosen as the victim. Is it an indication that he's gay? If he's predominantly heterosexual at that point, why was I chosen by a man as a sexual target? Does he know something about me I don't know about myself? Remember, abuse often happens at a time when boys are just trying to get their heads on straight about their sexual sense of themselves to begin with. And remember the myth that arousal means consent, that if a boy gets aroused by what's going on, it means he consented to what was going on. That's not true. Almost any adolescent boy who was touched sexually is going to get an erection. But this is very confusing to a boy who up till now has thought of himself as basically heterosexual. And he sees that he is aroused when he's touched by a man, and he immediately begins to question, who am I? Does he know something about me that I don't know myself? Remember that? And again, this is especially confusing if the abuser is of the opposite sex from the boy's own object choice. If the boy is predominantly gay at that point, he may feel prematurely hurried into defining himself as gay. Any boy is likely to ask himself, was I chosen because I seemed interested? Am I interested? Did he know I wasn't man enough to resist? Did my femininity or my sissiness or my soft side show enough to attract his attention? The worries for boys growing up homosexual is, did I ask for it? Was my interest in men so obvious that I really want it, even if it felt kind of icky? If I found it exciting, does that mean it wasn't a molestation? And most important, is this why I'm gay? Now, some boys know already by the time they are abused that they are basically gay, or probably gay, or whatever. But not all boys do. And not all boys have articulated to themselves at the time they are abused. Remember, abuse can happen at a very, very young prepubescent age. Most gay boys try at some point to think about why they are gay. And abuse is very convenient to think about, oh, that's what happened to me. That's why I'm gay. And this can happen whether the perpetrator was gay or straight, male or female. And it makes it very hard if you believe that this is why you're gay. Why you're gay. It's very hard to have a positive concept of yourself as a gay man because it was trauma that got you there in your mind. And so that's a whole lot to work through in treatment. Even if there's no obvious trauma, gay boys learn that gay relationships, when they've been abused this way, that gay relationships are illicit, secret, illegal, involve exploitation, and with power dynamics. And this has implications all the way through life. I remember a man I treated who said that he had been known, a gay man, who he had been known to throw a lover across the room in the middle of sex if for a moment he felt he was being overpowered in a way that was and felt helpless because he suddenly got triggered. This was someone who thought that he felt okay about being gay. Okay, and the third idea to take away, masculine gender socialization, feelings about homosexuality, fears of becoming an abuser. Fears of becoming an abuser. There's a folkloric idea that sexually abused boys almost inevitably become sexually abusing men. Now, it's true that perhaps 40% of convicted predators claim to have been abused, but there was one study done of incarcerated pedophiles that showed that only 10% of them at least passed the lie detector test about whether they had been abused. You get better treatment in prison if you say you've been abused, and you get therapy, and there are a lot of reasons to try to fake it like that. So in fact, about 1 in 10 do become abusers, but fearing that they will become abusive, even if they've never had any fantasies about it, affects a boy, affects a man, even when he has no fantasies, or it makes him fear that if anyone else finds out about his having been sexually abused, that he will abuse children. So I had a man who at age 60 finally acknowledged that he had been abused by his mother, full sexual intercourse with her. And he did go for treatment at that point. He did eventually tell his wife, but he would not tell his children because he felt sure that his daughters-in-law would not let him have any contact with his grandchildren, even though he had no fantasies about children. So that's a lot to take in. I'm going to switch here now and tell you about some findings in a study that was done, a doctoral study at the University of Pennsylvania by a man named Rick Azzaro, who did intensive interviews with men who had been sexually abused. And one of the questions he asked was, what would you tell a boy who was sexually abused? And this is what they said. Tell him you are not alone. There is nothing wrong with you. It wasn't your fault. You should talk to someone you trust, and things can get better. Then he asked them, what should therapists know based on these men's own experiences in therapy? Well, here are the barriers to seeking treatment that these men talked about. The compounded isolation experienced as a result of the abuse, the shame, and the cultural gender expectations that men don't express their feelings and seek help. They found professionals were judgmental, at least enough of them were, and did not take the time or interest to understand their abuse experience. Recognize that much of what goes on in therapy defies stereotypic ideas about masculinity, admitting the need and requesting for help, relying on others, recognizing and expressing feelings. These are all things that came out of therapy. One man said, I literally, at the beginning of therapy, I literally did not have the words to express what I was feeling, what I was thinking, and so it took time. And in my experience, as a supervisor, as a teacher, even people who believe they are open to talking to a patient about their sexual abuse find ways to not really ask the important questions, like what happened? How did that feel? They will often wait for a patient who has acknowledged having been sexually abused. They'll wait for him to say more about it. They don't ask the question. Men will often take that to mean, I don't want to hear. This is too much for me. Sometimes, see me. And sometimes therapists really don't want to hear. I mean, who does want to hear about the sexual abuse of a child in detail? Exactly what happened, exactly what he felt like, exactly what this man seemed like. I'm talking about an abuser now, or this woman seemed like at the time. These are difficult things to manage for the listener, as well, of course, as for the patients themselves. So doing detailed inquiries is difficult, but absolutely necessary when you're doing treatment with a sexually abused person. And I'm talking specifically now about men, of course. So how are we doing on time? I have time to say a little bit more about the relational after effects. Relational consequences of sexual betrayal, it doesn't fundamentally influence the direction or predominating orientation, but it does influence the relatedness, sexual and otherwise. In general relatedness, there's often a distrust of power and authority. The ability to form attachments is severely compromised by having internalized authorities as treacherous and undependable. Often these people have trouble with bosses, certainly, or with parents. If I'm talking about parents who were not abusers as well as those who were, or with teachers. They may need to be in control in the way that I was talking about with this man who his lover across the street. He may feel that relationships always include a power differential, that you can't have, you can't be equal partners. Power is often eroticized, even in non-sexual situations. Or such a man may maintain distance, be phobic about emotional attachment. I had a patient who felt he was very friendly, he was likable. I liked him, everybody around him was likable, but he was very frozen inside, and he always felt he was faking it. And he had a partner, a woman, who had a disease. It looked like we're quite certain that she was going to die. And it was only, he told me, it was only because he knew she was going to die that he could marry her, because he felt he could fake intimacy with her for 2 or 3 years until she died. But she didn't die, she recovered. And that's when he came to treatment, because he couldn't deal with that kind of intimacy. Victimization also makes a boy often take on responsibility for others' feelings. If you've been told, do this to make daddy happy, then daddy's happiness is your responsibility. And that can often be generalized to everybody's happiness is your responsibility. In intimate and sexual situations, often they can't differentiate between or among sex, love, nurturing, affection, and abuse. There's a very famous paper that some of you may be familiar with. I urge you to read it if you're interested, by Sándor Ferenczi, who was one of Freud's most brilliant students. He was Hungarian. And he wrote a paper called Confusion of Tongues Between Parent and the Child. Freud, as you know, I'm sure, had come up with the seduction, the so-called seduction theory, in which, in the late 1890s, in which he said that his female patients had become hysterics because they haven't been seduced by men. He later backed down from that because there had been such an uproar about it, among many other reasons why he backed down from it. And so the received wisdom in psychoanalysis at that point was that his second thought about the so-called seduction theory was that in fact these were not seductions, but they were fantasies and wish fulfillments. Come 30 years later, Ferenczi wrote a paper called Confusion of Tongues Between Parent and the Child, in which he believed his patients who said they had sexual relationships with caretakers. It caused a huge rift between him and Freud, from which he never recovered, and he died a year later. But it's a brilliant paper. And here's what he was talking about. He's talking about how a child in a situation like this is speaking what he called the language of tenderness. The parent is speaking the language of what he called passion. So the parent believes that the child is answering him in the language of passion, and so that the child is welcoming these sexual advances. Child believes that the parent is speaking to him in the language of tenderness, meaning what parents and children usually feel for one another. And so he goes along believing this is what happens, and then they crash. And that's how Ferenczi viewed the trauma of sexual abuse and sexual betrayal. And I think it's quite a very brilliant insight. a sexually abused man. I was once running a group. I mean, I run groups now too. I shouldn't say that. But once in the group I was running, two of the men, and there was a rule in this group that you were not allowed to touch without permission. And in the elevator leaving the group, one of the men just leaned over and fixed the other man's collar. And the other man blew up at him. He was sure that this was a seduction. He was taking what was basically something being spoken in the language of tenderness and reacting as though it had been this fixing of the collar had been done in the language of passion. And he felt extremely traumatized by it. The other man was confused and began to question his own motivations. Maybe I did mean something more than I thought, because he also had that same kind of confusion. So other problems in interpersonal relation in intimate relationships. Some men can be phobic about sex. One man said that, and I'm quoting here, the trouble with sex is there's always someone in your face. Well, of course there's always someone in your face. He couldn't bear it. Children are who are sexually abused are taught that their sexuality is a kind of an interpersonal currency. It's what they have to offer. And so they will often lead with it. And so these are the ones who are seen later in life as being overly seductive. It's because that's what they were taught to be. And that's a lot of unlearning to do. For some, sexual desire itself is abusive. One man thought that a gay man thought that when he was in a gym and he was admiring other men, that his admiration was abusive. And when he really questioned it, he said he suddenly figured out that his abusers had no shame about what they did. His abusers were all presumably straight men in a small town that he grew up in. He was gay. He said they had no shame about what they did, so he took on their shame, their dissociated shame, I should say, and began to feel that sexual desire itself is abusive. And then also you have to think about sadistic, masochistic, and exploitative relationships when you're thinking about what happens following sexual betrayal. A man may be hungry for contact, but phobic about it. He may solve this via frequent anonymous or semi-anonymous contacts while simultaneously drowning in boundary-less relationships that were love relationships. Sometimes those relationships were ones in which he cannot feel sexual desire, can only feel it for strangers. Now, the anonymous encounters, this gets back to what I said before about why dissociated sexual encounters kind of help, sort of. They soothe while taking care of this phobia about relatedness. But as soon as the sexual act is finished, he no longer feels loved. And I think that's about where I'm going to stop and maybe answer some questions. Hi, Dr.
Very
Watson.
well. Thank you so very much. This has been just incredible in terms of how you've laid it all out and what you've given us, for this topic that so often is not spoken about. And I think very important is the point you made about therapists, and when we don't ask, that it can be assumed that we don't care to hear.
Right.
And so I think that is really very important for us. So thank you for this really just great presentation.
Appreciate that.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions and answers, comments. Please use the Q&A, but we'll monitor both chat and Q&A because we find that people oftentimes use both, but we're open to any questions that you may have. Until we get a question, I'd like to ask your thoughts about Black men who have experienced sexual abuse in the context of oftentimes this hypersexualized view of Black males. If you could speak to that.
Well, you just did. I think, you know, it's everything I said about masculine gender socialization hyped up 10 times. And I think, and I don't want to, I want to be very careful about talking in stereotypic terms here. But I think I'm remembering that when Male Survivor, the organization that I co-founded, as we tried to reach out to Black organizations to get more Black members, particularly church groups, would not talk to us because they said it never happened there, because it was so forbidden in the more well, I don't know what more, but anyway, in the church groups, and so we didn't do very well with that. I think it's tragic. I think, given the world of Black men, to try to teach them that they don't have to be that kind of man is a tremendous task. I don't know that a white man can do it. I don't know that a Black woman can do it. I mean, perhaps we can. I shouldn't say that. But we have a much tougher road than, say, a Black male therapist would have. Because just as with white, or I should say non-Black patients, because I have patients of all different kinds of colors. In general, it is easier for me, I should have said this before, it is easier for me and for another male therapist to critique masculine gender socialization because we're coming from a different position than a woman does, at least in the view of a man who's trapped in this kind of worldview of himself. It can be done, but it has to be done carefully.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure I really answered the question, but I don't think I can. I don't think I'm equipped to.
Well, I appreciate the response that you provided. We have a question, so let me go to that. How best can loved ones of the abuser be supportive?
Don't tell him to get over it. He'll get over it if and when he's ever ready, and he'll never get over it. Actually, neither would a woman. And often friends, loved ones don't get that.
Yeah.
So instead, to understand that they're going to come waves of times of stress, times of other kinds of trauma that bring up this trauma, where this gets kicked up again, surprisingly to everybody, including him, and perhaps even unknown. So he may have rages that seem to have nothing to do with anything that's going on. And to just not rise to the bait, but do your best to soothe instead and understand and comfort.
Okay.
My book, Beyond Betrayal, is written for the general public. It's written for men who've been sexually abused, but it's also written for their loved ones. And so I would recommend it The last chapter is specifically for the loved ones, but the last chapter won't matter to you if you haven't read the rest of the book first.
Okay.
That's what I would suggest.
I think we have the links to your books in the chat, and if not, we will be sending it to all of the registrants, so they will get that from us.
Okay.
Okay.
And if you can't find them, just go on Amazon and look up my name.
Yeah, and make sure you put the B in it.
Okay.
Okay. What are some of the ways you introduce the topic of possible sexual abuse to a client who is in therapy for a completely unrelated matter?
Well, one thing to do is to early in the history early in the treatment take a decent history, which will often include at least some attention to whether you were ever touched inappropriately, or do you recall any childhood, what are your earliest childhood sexual experiences or feelings? What do you remember? Not necessarily leading with the idea that it was abuse, because all children have some kind of early sexual experience. Hopefully mostly benign. Just when did you start feeling sexy? So that's one way. Another is if someone starts talking, as you know, from all of the symptoms that I've described, it makes it easy, if it's really on your mind, to lead him there, to just ask in a quiet way whether there ever were any times when he was hurt, whether he was, and I should say, I didn't say this early on, I didn't specify this early on. The reason that there's so much difference in the research is because the questions that the researchers asked. If you ask a man if he's been abused, he'll probably say no, for all the reasons I just said. But when the researchers would ask about specific things, like what I just said, your earliest sexual touch that you remember, was the earliest time that you remember feeling sexually excited or sexually frightened or aroused, you'll get there.
Okay, thank you. Do we have other questions? Yeah, looks like one just popped up. Oh, no, that was the same one. It's been answered.
I can't answer it. I can't ask her to answer it again. I don't think my answer would be that different.
Do we have any more questions for Dr. Gartner? Well, I'll ask you, Dr. Gartner, is there anything that you might have said, but felt that time did not permit you to say that you would like to say?
Well, I probably would have gone more into the relational after effects, but also the treatment and the transference and countertransference issues. I've written 2 papers. One is trauma and counter-trauma resilience and counter-resilience, which became a book. The other one appears in another book, but it's not in my books. It's called Dissociation and Counter-Dissociation. And what I'm talking about there is how hard this work is. And in those 2 papers, I've talked about how I personally have been affected by doing this work. And I try to talk about how to protect yourself from being overwhelmed by the trauma of, I'm a vessel for 3,000 men now. I contain in some way all that trauma. How do I do it? I try to live well. I try to live a somewhat balanced life as best I can. I try to I take vacations, I take trips. The older I get, the more trips and vacations I take. because I can, because I can, because I can. And but I have not stopped doing this work because I like doing this work, and I think it's important to do. But sometimes you hear stories that chill you completely. I've heard, well, I don't know if I should, I don't know that I'm going to traumatize people by giving specific examples. But people whose lives, boys whose lives were threatened, boys who were forced to appear in S&M movies, boys who were trafficked. These stories, if you let yourself ask the questions, which I do and most people don't, it means you get to hear things that you really have to take a deep breath about. And it's important also to let somebody know that this shouldn't have happened. To not just be a blank screen about that. There's a book by Davies and Crawley, which people who work with sexual abuse are probably familiar with. It's called Treating the Adult Survivor of Childhood Sexual Abuse, a Psychoanalytic Perspective. But they really don't mean that. They really meant treating the female adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse, because all their examples are female. It's a brilliant book. I don't mean to say anything different, but in my book, Betrayed as Boys, I go through 4 transference, countertransference paradigms that they were able to articulate, and I talk about how that works with men. I can't go into that here and now. Well, I actually can do to some extent. I can tell you what the paradigms are, but I can't go into an explanation of them now. One is a sadistic victimizer and a helpless victim. Each of these paradigms, what they point out is that in a given treatment, it can go back and forth which one is which one is the sadistic victimizer, which one is the helpless victim. In the transference relationship, sometimes I have felt victimized by my patient's stories. Or I have even wondered whether they were sadistically telling me things to shock me. And maybe they were, maybe they weren't. They were shocking me in any case. So I was feeling like his helpless victim at that moment. More likely, though, he's going to think that I am his sadistic victimizer, somehow repeating a pattern, and that he's my helpless victim. But it can go back and forth within a particular session. That's paradigm 1. Paradigm 2, seducer and seduced. It's kind of obvious which one of you is seducing, which one is being the seduced person. In my book, Betrayed as Boys, I talk about an incident where a highly dissociated man took off his pants during a session, supposedly to show me what had happened when he tried to seduce his own father, who had sexually abused him as a boy. But as a young adult, he tried to seduce him again because his father, he had outgrown his father's interests, unfortunately. I mean, I don't know whether it was unfortunate, but in his own mind, it was unfortunate at that point. So he was trying to show me what he did. And I felt extremely, well, first of all, he was trying to be my seducer. I was being this seduced person. I told him, put your pants back on. What are you doing? I mean, it's not, it's not what you usually think of as the kind of classical intervention that you have with the patient, but I definitely needed to set those limits. And it went back and forth because then he felt that I had victimized him and I was seducing him and I had shamed him about what he had done, which we had so innocently thought he was just trying to show me something for my benefit. And in his mind, he was right. That's what he was trying to do. But he also knew on some level, as we talked about it much further along, that he was testing me. It's not news to anyone who's a therapist here that sometimes therapists wind up having sex with their patients. He was testing to see, would I seduce him? Or could he seduce me, I guess is really what he was thinking. But would I succumb? And he wasn't sure. This is the interesting part. He wasn't sure what he wanted. Because if I did have sex with him, I would be betraying him and myself and my profession, but also giving him satisfaction of some sort. If I didn't, it basically meant he wasn't attractive to me. Because in his eyes, remember, sexuality is interpersonal currency. It's all he had to offer me. And if I turned it down, it must mean he wasn't important to me. That was an awful lot for us to get articulated between us, and it took us months. But that's basically what was going on. So there, I brought it up as an example of the seduced and the seducer, but it was also the victimizer and the victimized person. We went back and forth a lot. And probably to the other paradigms too, which I haven't thought about in this regard. Paradigm 3 is the rescuer and the needy entitled child. You want to rescue this poor traumatized person, and he feels so needy. And the more you try to rescue him, the needier he becomes. And then you feel, I can't do this. I'm being eaten up alive. And then you're the one who feels victimized by the patient. It has gone the other way on some occasions. I had once had a particular unusual moment where very shortly before the session began, I got news that a young friend of mine had died, very young, shortly after giving birth. And although the death was expected, she was 27. And I was really very shocked. And I went into the session, and the patient started to talk and then saw me. And he saw that my face was gray. And he asked about it. And I had to make a choice at that moment, whether to reveal what was going on or to somehow smooth it over. And I chose to tell him. He started to cry. I'm sorry, he did start to cry, but initially he was very, very helpful to me. He wanted to help me. I was the person who needed rescuing at that moment. And he wanted to become my rescuer. And I was indeed needy. He offered to stop the session if I felt the need. I said, no, I think actually having told you, then I can be more present here. And so he was the rescuer. I was the needy. I'm not saying I feel I was an entitled child, but I certainly was a needy child at that moment. And that's when he started to cry, because he said, you told me the truth. All my life, my family told me that what I saw wasn't happening. And so that led us down a whole other lane. So that was a time when I was the child. And then the final one is the ineffective, uninvolved parent and the neglected child. Here, the transference is that you are the parent that doesn't see what's going on with the other parent. And it's a very chilly place to be in the transference, because the child so much wants you to have saved him, to have recognized what was going on, and to not be uninvolved, and to not let him be neglected. So that's the fourth paradigm.
Mhm.
These are very complicated ideas. I invite you to look at Davies and Foley, and to look at my book to read a lot more about what I'm talking about here for therapists.
Well, thank you for sharing those paradigms, because at least they give us a sense, and we can go into more detail by reading the books you've just suggested. But those are important, for us to think about in the therapeutic relationship. We have a question here that has to do with approaching memory, a person's memory of sexual abuse, and being able to pace that person, as opposed to going ahead of them when they're not ready.
Okay. So many ways to answer that. So many things occurred to me as you were saying it.
And excuse me for a minute, also, because there's an addition to this, that they are focused more on the abuser and the abuser's memory, if I'm getting this right from written here.
Well, I'm not going to answer that question. I don't treat abusers. So, or very, very rarely, except people who have abused after having been abused. I often have treated men who, usually in adolescence, abused somebody else, having been abused, and then later on in life, as they became adults, became very ashamed of what they had done, and very guilty, and we've gone through that. I only once or twice have treated people who were basically abusing them. At this point, I'm much more victim identified. So I leave that to the people, and I thank God there are people who want to treat abusers. I'm not one of them. But, so I'm going to answer the question I thought I had a lot to say about. Sometimes people want to spill a lot much too fast. And this could be true of an abuser as well. So everything I'm saying probably, you can think about this as well. But and sometimes you need to slow down and slow them down, but you need to slow them down in a way that communicates that you do want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say, wow, that's really, if this is an initial session and suddenly someone just blurts out all this stuff, you listen. I listen for a few minutes, and I say, okay, this is really important, that I really want to hear about it. Before we get to that, can I get some context? I need to hear something about what your life has been like before this, and during this, and after this as well. And so that's when I will start to take something of a history. On the other hand, often there are people, by which I mean therapists, don't follow up their own questions with more questions. They think they got enough, and then if I have a supervisee, and they'll say, well, yes, they were abused when they were 10, and I say, well, how long did it go on? Well, I think it was probably for a couple of months, but I'm not sure. Didn't ask. Turns out it was years. Mm-hmm. You have to let what the patients, you have to understand whether a patient is decompensating in front of you, in which case you really have to be a holding environment and help him contain it, so that he can say it. You have to always say, some way or other, I want to hear this, when you're ready, when you're able to say it without falling apart with someone like that.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you for that. We have another question that is asking, how is it that an abuser, which you don't treat, and so you may not be able to answer, desire to answer this either, doesn't recall the abuse that that person has perpetrated, especially when they are an adult?
Go back to everything I said about dissociation. It's not just victims who dissociate. An abuser can be dissociating while abusing, may do the whole thing in a dissociated state, and truthfully, in his own mind or her own mind, say, no, this wasn't abuse, or I didn't do anything, nothing happened. I do think you need to confront them, and I think I shouldn't say I know nothing about treating abusers. That's not quite true. I think a very important piece of treating an abuser, including someone who was abused themselves and then went on to abuse, is to work on empathy, to help this person somehow acknowledge that what they did hurt someone. Now, if you're dealing with a sociopath, that's never going to happen. And certainly many predators are sociopaths, but many are not. But if they have been dissociating and fooling themselves consciously, unconsciously, whatever, telling themselves, well, he really wanted it, well, it really was a coming of age, well, I really helped him. To get them to experience, maybe by reading some survivors' stories, there are many that are published now, or role playing. Okay, be that boy now. Be that boy that you that 5-year-old in the movie theater. Try to tell me what's going on inside of him while you're touching him. Mm-hmm. That sort of thing, until they get to the point of realizing, oh, I hurt someone. Mm-hmm. I don't even remember what the question was anymore.
You got to it. You answered.
Okay, good.
This question you spoke about, and maybe it needs to be repeated, because the question is, how does the gender of the therapist affect sexual abuse therapy with the male client?
Okay. In any long-term treatment, any therapist is going to be experienced as male and female over time. I mean, I think therapists, know that if they do long-term treatment. However, I did say, well, first of all, some men will only be treated, will demand to be treated by a male therapist. Some demand to be treated by a female therapist. Some say they don't, either one is fine. Usually it's about shame. Some men are ashamed that another man knows that they were a victim. That's what it boils down to. But some are afraid that a woman will know that they were a victim, that they were not a man. I'm sort of being a little reductionistic here, but that's what it boils down to. And of course, you have to help a person get to the therapist that they think can help them. I think I have had patients tell me they could not tell their female therapists about things that had happened to them. They were just too ashamed. in that case, he came to see me after ending that treatment. But I'm sure there are many men who never come to see me because they couldn't bear to have me hear what happened to them, in the same way. So it's not, I can't give a recipe book about this, but I think you do need to be aware of how your gender, as well as your orientation, if that's on the table, is affecting the dynamic between you, and to inquire about it when it's appropriate. You hate all men. Well, what's it like to be sitting here talking to me about all this? To get a gauge of whether you have managed to, I'm talking about me now, whether I've managed to create a sense of safety, even though he's afraid of men. I've had a number of men referred to me for group therapy by their female therapists who would never, ever have come to see me on their own individually, but who eventually got to a point with a female therapist that they could face how terrified they were to be in a room with me. Sometimes they really had panic attacks, even just for an evaluation session to enter a group. And then to go into a room, and by the way, I did talk about group therapy for sexually abused men. It's a wonderful, wonderful treatment. For a man to walk into a room and suddenly realize he's surrounded by 6 or 7 or 8 other people who have gone through some version of what he went through is shocking to them, because they sort of knew it, because they've read stuff, or they haven't, or they read the newspapers, or they know about these things. That's different than the visceral sense of, here I am, I'm safe, I'm at home. Yeah. So it's terribly sad that it isn't offered more.
Okay, thank you. This has been most impactful. It is just incredible. You have given us so much in such a short time. This could have been a 10-week course at least. So thank you so very much for honoring us with this incredible presentation. A lot of wisdom that you've imparted to us. And I hope that more of us will ask of our clients, do the kind of history taking that will allow us to really meet the need that exists in this population.
Well, I really appreciate having been invited, and all your kind attentions.
Well, thank you so much. And again, want to thank the East 87th Street Fund for sponsoring tonight's lecture. So as I said, this is the last lecture in the 2022-23 series. So we will let you know when we have more up for the 2023-24 academic year. Thank you so very much. Have a good night, everyone, or good day, depending on where you are in the world. So thank you.